This past week, I was contacted by someone who had called me asking for prayer. And it had been a month or so, I believe, since we had last spoken. And as I listened to them share the basis for their prayer request, I felt myself really being taken aback. There had been significant change in their life since our last conversation. And they were now in the midst of a very painful, hurtful, challenging circumstance and situation and experience in their life. And so I listened, and then we spent some time in conversation. And when our overall time together was complete and I continued to just sit in the quiet of prayer for a few more minutes myself, it dawned on me that I had just taken part in an experience of our lesson topic for today. You see, throughout our conversation, the person had made many statements to me that could be qualified, in my opinion, as having come from spiritual principle. Statements of belief that there was good to be had in this moment, that there was good to be seen, good to be experienced in this circumstance. Statements that they would be okay, that everything they knew was going to be okay. And almost every one of these statements ended with a comma, not a period. And it was followed by the word but. But I don't see the good. But I'm not feeling or experiencing the good. But I'm not okay. But everything is not okay. In fact, everything right now is just pretty crappy. Experiencing the ebbs and the flows between good and crappy, the tensions that between what we might call spiritual truths and the realities of the day, is to experience the title of today's lesson, which is Responsible Hope. Responsible hope is something that has been a long-term interest for a theology professor whose name is Ellen Ott Marshall. I came upon an interview for an online publication that she had done 2 years ago when she was teaching a summer session at the Duke Divinity School. And the online site is one that I sometimes use for some resources for my lessons. It's called faithandleadership.com, if you ever want to check that out for yourselves. So let me share her answer to the question, what is responsible hope? And she said, responsible hope, for me, is a way to indicate that our hope, our language about it, and our practices related to it need to remain accountable to the losses and limits of life, to the real vulnerabilities of life. Thinking about hope responsibly is a way to encourage and foster a sense of possibility that doesn't deny the way or the ways in which things are not okay. To remain accountable to the losses and the limits and the vulnerabilities of life, and to not deny the ways that things are not okay. This is what we want to delve into a little bit more today. So let's begin with that idea of the ebb and the flow of hope, the tensions between the pulls of our spiritual beliefs and the realities of our lives. See, now, responsible hope basically says that if we are someone who does resolve to hope, then we have to regularly recalibrate that hopefulness to the realities around us, as well as the realities that go on inside of us. It tells us that we're not to wallow in the challenges of reality. We're to honestly confront them, be with them, and work to change the story. Professor Marshall shared a story of the time that she was working on her graduate dissertation. And its theme was the tension between hope and the realities of the world. And while she was working on it in New York City, she and her husband went to see an art exhibit of the artist Pablo Picasso. And while they were in the museum, they came upon two paintings that were placed fairly close to one another. And as they viewed them, they both found themselves going back and forth from one to the other, just looking at one and then moving and looking to the other. And eventually her husband said, "Hey, that's your dissertation." And she agreed. The first painting was completed. It took Picasso 2 or 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. It was completed in 1945, and he titled it The Charnel House. And he worked on it over those few years during the time that concentration camps were spreading into France. And the painting is one that depicts just piles of bodies, piles of appendages of bodies. But in it, you can make out 3 figures. You can make out a man, a woman, and a child. The second painting was done a little bit earlier in 1943, and Picasso titled this one First Steps. And in this one, you see a mother standing behind her child and supporting her child as he or she is learning to walk. So Marshall shared that she saw sweetness in their awkwardness, that she could feel the shifting of the weight between one and the other. She said it connected her to her own experiences of that with her own children when they were young, and she felt the excitement of that time once again. She found that as she moved back and forth between these two paintings, that her study of hope had now shifted into a reflection on the practice of hope. This exercise, as she called it, this back and forth, she said it became one that she began to use as a means of grounding herself into each of her days. She would hold those visions and go back and forth in her times of meditation and prayer. And she now also had this visual tool that she could use to communicate her thoughts of our moving back and forth, moving through the tensions that exist between hope and the realities that we face. So looking at hope in this way helps us to differentiate it from a couple of things. And one of those is optimism. The way Professor Marshall views optimism is one of seeing it as denying the losses of life, denying the limits and the vulnerabilities of life. She sees it as a more, pull yourself up, by your bootstraps. It's a can-do attitude and that kind of thing. And she notes that responsible hope is a form of correcting that kind of thinking, correcting it in the sense, in her words, correcting the tendency that we have sometimes when people are in deep struggle to immediately, first thing out of our mouths, immediately reassure them that everything is going to be okay. Responsible hope maintains that sense of possibility while never losing sight of the obstacles and the challenges that are currently in the way of those possibilities becoming the new reality. And so from this perspective, hope is a bit more sobering than optimism. It serves to keep us attentive to the crappy, right? While at the same time, still encouraging us to hold to and work to bring about our beliefs in possibilities, new possibilities. Another difference that Professor Marshall presented is one that exists with tradition. And the tradition she was speaking of was that of religious tradition. And so one of the differences that we can find in religious traditions exists in the way that, God, the kingdom of God, unity and oneness with God, in this context of her interview, that's the object of our hope. There are differences that exist as to how that is taught. For example, there is a theology it's called Liberationist Theology. And it's one that places a very heavy emphasis on concern for the poor, concern for the oppressed, stepping into a lot of social action around these kinds of ideas. And it teaches that this object of hope, as I just defined it, is not something that's found at the end of history, at the end of the world, or at the end of, just our individual lives here in this world. Rather, it teaches that that object of hope is intimately related to this life that we know. And it's unfolding here. And our job is to either usher it in or create the space for which it to emerge. So the corrective here is one that states a position that is against the more traditional religious theology that views spirit and all that it represents as something being out there, something that is separate from us, something that is otherworldly. It's something that you get to maybe at another place at another time, as opposed to it being right here with us and within us all the time. Another difference in religious tradition can be found by looking at the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas. Marshall pointed out that one of his teachings was to make a distinction between theological virtues and moral virtues. St. Thomas believed that theological virtues, faith, hope, love, those kinds of things, they were things that were infused in us, given to us in order to draw us to it. So right away you can hear that same God's out there, we're separate from God, kind of teaching. While on the other hand, St. Thomas felt that moral virtues were things that we learned through practicing them. So Marshall posited that our believing or saying to someone else that hope is something we either are or aren't given or infused with by Spirit is hurtful and even harmful. And I would agree. I mean, imagine if in my phone call I had told the person who had just poured their heart out to me, well, seems clear to me that God's not infused you with the virtue of hope. I mean, imagine the hurt, the damage that could do to someone moving through any kind of challenge, someone who's experiencing, depression or despair or hopelessness. So an alternative that Marshall presented was to merge St. Thomas's ideas, merge together the ideas of theology and practice together. Kind of sounds like Unity's teachings, right? We have spiritual principles that we merge by putting them into action. She has found in her research and along with just her own life experiences that hope really is something that requires us to practice it. And she believes that it calls for us to do so whether or not we are feeling the presence of a higher power in our lives or not. So let's look at the practice. Like anything else, right? The more we practice something, the better we're going to get at it. So we practice hope, stepping into it, knowing that there's going to be some days where we really feel it. It's going to be strong in us. It's going to be so present in us. And we're going to go into it knowing that there's going to be some days where we feel it's slowly dissipating away or just gone. And it's for us to build back up again. So there were three things that Marshall offered to us to try to remember as we consider stepping into this more intentional, focused practice of responsible hope. And the first thing she said is to remember that it's not something that we're going to be doing alone, because she views the practice as being our attentiveness to resources of hope that are already out there in the world to be seen by us. And then she said to remember that it's really what we're trying to do is create, a space in our lives, in the ebbs and the flows of our days, in the tensions that might exist. Have some level of openness and willingness to see Spirit's presence, to see its expression being brought forth in the world around us. And if we could do that, If we could do that, she says, those are the two things that when you feel that, when you see that, when you believe that, you just grab onto it, and they will encourage you as you start in your own practice. So what might that practice look like? Well, it could look like movement. Movement back and forth, just like the paintings for our professor. Movement that we can do now in the midst of personal challenge or the larger kind of collective challenge, or the challenges that we're kind of moving through as a collective, humanity. On that larger scale, since it's fresh, we can go back just a couple of weeks ago to when the protests started following the killing of George Floyd. And for hours, we could sit in front of our TVs and watch, and we saw tens of thousands of people, throngs of people marching all across our country, all around the world. And through that vision of the throngs of people marching, we were reminded, we could see the darkness of what had brought those uprisings, the darkness of racism. And if we kept watching, we could then see fires being set and looting being done. And if we kept watching, we saw tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets and police batons being used. If we kept watching, we saw heavily armed people lining the streets of our nation's capital, lining the steps of our national monuments. And if we kept watching, we could also see a protester and a police officer sharing a hug. And if we kept watching, we could see dozens of healthcare workers stepping out of the confines where they were fighting the virus of COVID-19 and line the streets and the sidewalks, applauding and cheering on those who marched in front of them that were now fighting a new virus of racism. And if we kept watching, we could see George Floyd's little girl sitting on the shoulders of, I think it was an uncle, just singing out, "My daddy changed the world." See, that's movement from one to the other that allows us to see possibility present in the midst of incredibly difficult circumstances. It's the movement that allows us to see what we are capable of when it comes to our relationships with other people. Another practice of responsible hope is something that Professor Marshall likened to spiritual discernment, prayerful discernment. And she noted that it's one thing to discern the presence of a higher power, whatever name you want to call it. But she said we're also invited to discern that higher power's call in us, especially the one or the ones that are calling us in different directions than we had in mind. I think that there are days that we all probably would love to just have our callings perfectly aligned with what Spirit's callings might be. But I know that I've said this before, and I've heard others say that we make plans, and then the universe just laughs and laughs and laughs. But most of the time, I don't think we're in the mood to laugh in those moments. Feeling called into new experiences, especially the ones that we never expected having, the ones that we don't see, penciled in on our calendars anywhere. They can be scary, and probably at the same time, they could be very humbling. I have a minister friend and colleague that I can liken to going through this kind of experience right now. When we were in seminary, so we're going back, 2007, 2008, she was really clear. Her calling was to Unity Church ministry. Unity minister in a church, and she saw herself in that way, saw her role a certain way. And over the past few weeks, she has been listening to this calling in her that includes her admitting and and learning about and beginning to work with things concerning her own white privilege, and also stepping very publicly and vocally into a more activist role as it pertains to addressing the issue of racism. And she never saw herself in that light. Remember, she said she was going to be a church minister. She's going to have a church. She was going to go there on Sunday. She was going to give a lesson. That box would be checked. It was a pretty concise box that she had placed herself in. She never saw herself in this current light that's beginning to shine, and she never saw herself giving Sunday lessons on topics that are at times somewhat controversial in nature. And not everyone is happy with her. She shared, and this is all on her Facebook page, and it's public, and so I'm not sharing anything out of context or breaking any confidentiality. But she has shared that she has lost, Facebook friends. She's been unfriended by people. She alluded to having members of her church that she's now serving leave the church because of again, posts that she is authoring online or just sharing from someone else, or lessons that she has included in their Sunday experiences. Now, it's not for me to render an opinion or make a judgment one way or the other. I don't know nearly enough of the story to even begin to try if I wanted to. But I know that my colleague is in a very powerful and very uncertain time of discernment, feeling those tensions, perhaps between this responsible hope that we're talking about and the challenging realities that are in her life right now. And she wrote in one of her more recent Facebook posts, where she went into a pretty extended discussion or sharing of what's going on for her right now and what she's moving through. And she closed that post by saying, "I'm not alone, but I am on shaky ground. But there's no other honest choice for me. This is who I really am." It seems to me that my friend may be right there on the edge of what might be the most important piece of responsible hope. As Professor Marshall put it, she said, "It's not whether we hope, but how we hope appropriately." How we hope appropriately. How? How do we express this hope in ways that would be deemed appropriate? Now, in any class I've ever taken or things I've read about conflicts and challenges and being with them, there's always been two things that show up each and every time. And one is, very simply, that challenges and conflicts are a very natural element of life. They are a very natural part of our lives. And secondly, that within each one that occurs, there exists a catalyst for something good to come out of it. So isn't that right there just the crux of what Professor Marshall has been sharing about this hope with us all along? I mean, we have this difficult thing in our lives, that there is some sense of possibility for good to come from it. And it's for you and for me to be attentive to that, to see it, identify it, and then engage in ways that bring it forth responsibly, appropriately. This how we do it is what was preoccupying Professor Marshall's discernment about hope 2 years ago. And I think we might be in that very same place today, because we do see a lot of good trying to come forth from people, from institutions, as they figure out the what that is needed. The what, whether they are, policy changes or social justice reforms, or, paying attention to changing the brutality of some, police actions. And where we're going to come to eventually is the way we do these things. How are we going to write new policies or present changes that we wish to have enacted in terms of all of these different challenges that are before us? because we're already seeing different thoughts and different ideas being expressed, each and every one of them coming from someone's bias of personal beliefs, someone's bias of personal moral understandings, and the differences in those do not make one person right and the other person wrong. So how do we bring it all together appropriately, responsibly? And Marshall didn't have the answers at the time she gave her interview. And I don't have the answers today, because I think we are all still in the midst of figuring it out. But we can continue the practice. And maybe to get some inspiration for that, we can go to a young woman, Anne Frank, who could inspire us perhaps to continue the search, to stay true to the cause, to the calling. See, as a Jewish teenager, she wrote these words at the same time Picasso was creating his paintings, while she was confined in an upper room with her family, cramped and hiding from the Nazis. She wrote, "It's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals, because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them, because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." So let's allow her words to inspire us to remain hopeful. Let's continue to do what is ours to do, to learn the how of being responsible with its use. And let's do all that we can to prove Anne Frank right. God bless you.